we better get straight to it because he's in Australia. I guess he's been lying in the sun all day because what else do you do in Australia? There's no other reason to go. Let's welcome to the show Craig Renney. Craig, kia ora and good evening to you, sir.
Kia ora, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Craig. Doing well. Thank you for joining us. This is a bit of an impromptu sort of conversation, but I thought what we'd do, I've got 3 clips from the stand-up today, and I've got the news story, which is about 3.5 minutes. Maybe we'll watch the news story, and then we'll have a chat and start bringing those actual, because obviously, 90 seconds from the stand-up is going to give us more direct information that you can speak to than the news story, but the news story will give us overall probably a better view. Let's have a look.
Don't expect any sweetness from the government's budget to be unveiled in just over 3 weeks. Finance Minister Nicola Willis today confirming this year's budget will not be a lolly scramble. As she admitted, it's not the easiest time to be putting together.
Like we said at the start of the show, like every finance minister for the last 40 years has said, but it's a headline still.
Together a budget. She also slashed the operating allowance. That's the new money available to spend in the budget from $2.4 billion to $1.3 billion, meaning less funding for government departments and initiatives. Nicola Willis did emphasise, though, increased investment in some areas, including health, education, law and order, and the Defence Force. Senior political reporter Ben.
I thought it was interesting when I was watching the story live as well. I mean, cost of living crisis. I mean, health you could put in there possibly, maybe a bit of education, but not really anything to directly one-on-one impact the cost of living crisis, which is interesting.
Dick Collins has more details, reaction, and what it could mean for you.
With trade wars and uncertainty afoot, the Finance Minister is treading carefully.
Let me be blunt. It's not the easiest time to be delivering a budget.
Nicola Willis believes we're borrowing too much as a country, and now is the time for restraint.
While you can keep
so many points to make already. So many points to make already.
Giving the credit card a hammering for a while, left unpaid, it does eventually get declined.
They borrowed an additional $12 billion in last year's budget in order to fund tax cuts. One of the reasons they have the big structural deficit they have is because they delivered tax cuts that the country simply couldn't afford.
Nicola Willis says the focus of this budget will be health, education, police and defence.
Our savings and reprioritisation program, that's generated billions of dollars that gives us the room to make the investments that are really needed.
But Nicola Willis's new spending envelope is being cut from $2.4 billion to $1.3, and much of that's already been spent on things like new cancer drugs.
We can't cut our way to greater prosperity. We can't cut the health system further. We can't cut the education system further.
There will be a little something extra to ease the cost of living pressures for some.
I do want to really be careful with your expectations. The measures are modest. This is not a budget that's a lolly scramble.
Deploying that age-old go-to line for those eager to appear prudent managers of our economy.
That is not a lolly scramble.
Won't be a lolly scramble.
There cannot be a lolly scramble.
It doesn't mean that there's a lolly scramble.
Grant Robertson used to say his budgets weren't going to be lolly scrambles either.
But they always were.
We asked the public what they think the government's priorities should be for this budget.
The main one is the health sector. That's where they need to put the dollars first. Because if you don't have a healthy population, you don't have happy people. Simple as that.
On healthcare, hospitals, medical, definitely.
Police, education and healthcare.
And what's hurting the most in terms of the cost of living?
Supermarket prices for food.
I could make a meal in $10 a few years ago. Now it costs like at least $30.
I want to go to his house for dinner, Chewie. He can only make a meal for $30, mate. Ribeye every night with a bottle of, I don't know, some kind of nice wine alongside. $30. Woof.
They look in the basic necessity foods and stuff. If they control the price on that would be much helpful for the people.
The Finance Minister, though, trying to keep expectations in check.
All right, that's all we're going to do. So I've got some other clips to play you, Craig. And then we want to show the whānau. You and I have to talk as well. What are we doing about the podcast this week? But we'll do that later. And then we'll talk about the podcast that you and I have already recorded that people know about because we used that clip last night talking about Family Boost. But yeah, what are your reactions to the report that we've just watched?
I mean, it's astonishing, really. There's a few things it sort of talks about, really. The first of which is, you don't make decisions like this so close to the budget. The budget's 3 weeks away. This suggests essentially that Cabinet can't agree on what the budget is. And there's a lot of disagreement and chaos going on. It also suggests that the that ACT, and I'm guessing it's ACT, have laid down some red lines inside Cabinet, saying we won't agree to a budget where there is no pathway back to an Obergall surplus, so the surplus or the deficit number. And so they've cut the operating allowance, which essentially takes by my guesses, $4.5 billion of spending out of government spending over the next year. That gives them the ability to artificially say we might be able to get to an Obergall surplus by the end of the forecast period, which is 2029.
Just explain to us morons. You said Obergall twice, just so people.
Oh, sorry, forgive me. So Obergall, operating balance excluding exceptional gains and losses. So it's the thing that we call the surplus or the deficit.
Okay, it's the money they've got in their wallet.
And the Obergall surplus, the operating surplus, is the thing that governments target, trying to get it to exist, trying to get out of deficit in order so that they've got more money left over from their day-to-day spending, even after they've paid for everything. And that's what we generally think of as the Obergall. Now, if we look at the numbers, and we talked about health, for example, talk about health in the section there. Next year alone, the health service, just to keep the lights on, needs $1.55 billion. There's only $1.3 billion available in total. So even after you've used all of the available money, there's still not enough money just to pay for the cost of living changes inside health. Now, that doesn't include education, it doesn't include police, justice, anything else. It's just, we've spent all the money just in one department. And you've actually invested nothing new, because there's no new investments or new spending anywhere else. So I'm struggling to see how they're going to deliver, as the segment suggested, increased health, education, police, or defence spending from the available amounts of money. The only way they can do that is to cut.
We're going to show a chart that you made for the podcast supposed to be coming out Thursday, which is now, after today, irrelevant. We'll show that at the end, which is sort of what you're hinting at now. But first of all, Chewie, you got any questions before we go into some of these clips?
No. Keep rolling. I think the only thing that would have, rather than saying, hey, look, this isn't a lolly scramble, is if she just leans and looks dead down the camera and goes, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, well, we figured that out already. We figured that out last night as well. All right, let's have a look at this. This is a clip. It's only a minute and 10 seconds, and it's talking about the government books remaining out of balance. That's the heading for this clip.
Put simply, manageable government debt levels are an essential foundation for a strong economy and for your financial future. But achieving lower debt isn't easy because the government books remain out of balance. The post-COVID structural deficit has left a big gap between what the country needs to fund to deliver on the spending commitments previous budgets have made and what we need to earn to pay for that spending. The government is currently, rightly, borrowing billions to bridge the gap. Every Thursday afternoon, New Zealand Debt Management issues around $500 million of government bonds. Some of this is to roll over existing bonds that have expired, but large chunks of it are for new borrowing. It effectively means that the New Zealand government is borrowing $500 million every week. And that, by the way, is in addition to larger bond syndications we schedule each year.
Right. A couple of questions before we roll another 45 seconds. Is what she's saying accurate? Because she's saying we're borrowing $500 billion in bonds, but some of it's to cover other stuff. So are we actually borrowing? Is it actually a $500 negative every single year for the week for the country? Is that what we're saying?
No. No, so some of it is rolling over existing debt. So some debt matures. We need to replace that debt, so we reissue the debt, and that's what. So it's not adding to the net debt pile. It's only the new part of the debt which adds to the true debt pile.
Do we have any idea how much? How much is adding to it each week?
So last budget we borrowed the Crown borrowed an extra $12 billion.
So it's $1 billion a month.
So it's $1 billion a month.
So it's $250 a week.
But we also delivered $14.6 billion of tax cuts.
Well, this is the next question, because I've written down here that they're making all these statements about getting the books in balance and all the stuff we have to borrow. If we talked about $14 billion worth of tax cuts and $3 billion to landlords, that's $17 billion, and they borrowed 12. So I'm not smart, Craig, but if I can look at it and go, they opened up their wallet and they flicked out $17 billion. It was a choice, just a choice, all gone, 17 billion. And now they're talking about fixing the deficit, balancing the books, stopping borrowing as much. Why is there no one kind of, I don't know, laser pointing her like you would with a cat, going, give away, don't borrow, don't give away. It's like, it's so infuriating that a rodeo clown in Dunedin can have these thoughts. And she says it with such confidence that it would appear enough people buy it.
It is, as you point out, Pat, gaslighting of the highest order to say the debt is too high. We need to do something about debt. Ignore the fact that I've increased the debt significantly to pay for tax cuts to benefit groups like tobacco companies. And at the same time, I'm therefore going to cut services. I'm going to cut investment. I'm going to cut R&D. I'm going to cut the things that are actually going to grow the economy, which actually make the debt affordable in the first place. So I'm going to make people pay through reduced services, or forcing them to pay more charges in order to make right the problem I've created because of a completely unaffordable tax plan I promised at the last election. So
but hang on, but promised and then chose to carry through. I mean, we can't just let her off, because there's other things they promised that they didn't do, and there's other things they never told us about smoke-free 2025, which they then just added in. So it's not like, they made this promise and then they were bound by it. Horse shit. The national government promised to put our Dunedin hospital back to bigger and better than it was before Labor pared it back a little bit. They broke that promise pretty carefully. That wasn't hard for them to break. So just because they promised it, we can't just let them off. Not that you are, but they can't be let off that they made this promise, so they had to do it. Horse shit. Absolute horse shit.
I think you're right to highlight the choice there. Yesterday we discovered, or this morning, sorry, we discovered that there are going to be fewer ICU beds in the new Dunedin hospital
down
because
by
they're going to invest. They're going to invest less in that facility. At the same time as they're reducing, they've decided to cut the amounts of new spending, but at no point in time have they revisited the tax cuts that they've put on the table. At no point in time have they revisited any of the spending decisions that they've made. The $1 billion of new growth fund, which hasn't appeared anywhere, doesn't do anything. The billions of unfunded promises for new roads around the country, which they have no idea how they're going to finance. The $20 billion health investment fund, which is a 12-page PowerPoint, which has no new money in it. And if we just take health again, just for an example, again, we need $1.5 billion. There isn't $1.5 billion, but over the past few weeks, Simeon Brown's also promised $285 million for new GPs. He's promised $50 million for private sector investment in health. He's promised $30 million for new practice nurses inside GPs' practices. These are all good things, but there's no new money. So that means it has to go on top. So you're now adding hundreds of millions of dollars of extra expenditure, but because there's no money, it acts as a cut.
Yeah.
And this is the challenge I have, is that they're not being honest with New Zealanders about the scale of the challenge that's in front of them. And they're not being honest by saying, well, we'll just cut the operating allowance, as if nobody in New Zealand will then know what that means and what the likely consequence of that is for cuts to other government departments.
Chewie, if you want in, you should jump in, because I'm going to just keep trucking with some of these videos. So put your hand up.
I'm glad you brought up the hospital thing. Like the words that came out of my mouth when I saw a news story about cuts to, I think it's operating,
ICU
beds or
intensive
something.
care.
ICU beds
from 30 to 20,
which brings it below what our current hospital has.
Yep.
Like, I'm furious all over again. And I think the budget day, I'm going to have to be somehow strapped down.
We'll do a live show that night from the pub, Chewie. We'll go to Wolf and do a live show from there.
Actually, that's
and
not a bad idea.
That's it. But do they still have the greenhouse in the back of Wolf?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
From the greenhouse.
Best part of Dunedin.
Yeah. So in terms of them, but in terms of health, I mean, but the thing that I would actually look at, health has some money. Education has absolutely no money. So every year we need approximately $500 million just to keep the lights on in health. And it isn't there. So if you need to find that money, then you've got to cut $500 million from somewhere else. We saw huge cuts at the last budget, very significant cuts at the last budget. We're now adding further cuts on top. Every time you take $1 away from government spending, not only is it you've got to cut something to do it, you're adding to the cost of living pressures for everything else, because inflation still exists. So it gets progressively harder and harder to do.
Right. Next point here. It's only a 45-second clip, but she says this, that you used the phrase gaslighting before, Craig. She says something at the end of this 45 seconds. Well, before we do that though, because it kind of dovetails into this. Every journalist that has access to these people, especially Nikki Nobodes, the start of every single question should be, in lieu of you giving away $17 billion in tax cuts and landlord reimbursements, and then ask your question. It's a bit the same of this, because she is gaslighting here because she wants us to ask the question that she should be asking herself. Have a listen.
And that level of borrowing obviously can't go on forever, or else our kids and our grandkids will be left with unsustainable debt and considerable economic uncertainty. Most of you can probably relate to this if you think about your own household budget. Sure, sensible borrowing has its place, but no overdraft can be extended forever. And while you can keep giving the credit card a hammering for a while, left unpaid, it does eventually get declined. It's worth bearing this in mind next time somebody tries to suggest to you that the New Zealand government needs to spend more on something. The second question always needs to be, but how will we pay for it?
But how will we pay for it? Nicola Willis wants us, who are going, where's our Dunedin hospital, wants us to ask ourselves, but how will we pay for it? And what we've been screaming for the last 18 months is, hey, National, how are you going to pay for this with $17 billion going in tax breaks and landlord reimbursements? Craig?
I mean, it's not as if they haven't been told repeatedly over and over and over and over and over again that this is the case. So, you know, can I just, there's a couple of mischaracterizations though for the audience in that statement that are really important.
Yeah.
The first one of which is, you know, eventually the credit card will be declined. The last time we held a debt auction in New Zealand, it was 450% oversubscribed. So for every dollar that we managed to sell into the market, people wanted $4.50. So there's no shortage of that. There's no likelihood at any point in time soon ever of it being declined. New Zealand has net core current debt levels below those on the internationally comparable measure, below Australia, the UK, the US, Japan, pretty much every other developed world in the country.
So hang on. So should we need to extend our overdraft, New Zealand, we can get it from almost anywhere we want. There's no decline coming.
But specifically, if we borrow to invest in things that we actually need in the country, one, we lift the productive capacity of the country. Two, we lift the what we call the trend growth rate of the country, so we can grow faster before we hit inflation. And three, we can get around and do things better. We lift the quality of life for New Zealanders. Now, why wouldn't you do that at the same time as we have a housing shortage in the country, whilst 13,000 fewer people are working in construction, whilst we know we're desperately short of hospitals, schools, all the other things that we've failed to invest in for a really long time. So when Nicola says, if we keep borrowing, our kids will have to pay for the borrowing that we're doing today. That's true, but they'll also have the assets that we built. If you don't build the assets, your kids have to build the assets. You just haven't paid for the stuff that they should have on the way.
This is this classic bait and switch these guys are doing. We talked about the shell game leading up to the last election, where all they'd point at is the $10 billion debt to Kāinga Ora, but they'd never talk about the $25 billion worth of assets that Kāinga Ora now has. And if I could get an overdraft that gave me 2.5 times on the same day the assets to that overdraft, I'd be spending as much as I could, because we all know that the cheapest time to build something is yesterday, as we're now finding out with the ferries. Yeah.
Well, the ferries, but also street homelessness in many towns in New Zealand is frankly exploding, because we've kicked lots of people out of emergency housing, at the same time as we've stopped building Kāinga Ora housing. So, you know, these things should be being done, not just because they are good things, not just because New Zealand is short of them, but because now is exactly the right time after one of the steepest recessions we've had since 1991. To actually be doing that.
Yeah.
Instead, we're acting, as we in the jargon, we call this pro-cyclically. So the economy is a bit weak. It's really struggling to get traction for growth. So obviously the thing to do is to take even more money and more investment out of it, shaking confidence, losing jobs, and doing exactly the thing you should not be doing, and which 100 years of economic history tells us is a dumb idea right now.
One more clip, 45 seconds, and we're going to wrap with showing them that slide of yours, but it'll only be another couple of minutes and we'll wrap up altogether. So this is, again, hammering that idea of leaving debt for our children and grandchildren.
Our strategy is focused on two key goals: putting net debt on a downward trajectory and returning the books to an Obergalex surplus by 2028, for all the reasons I previously laid out. This strategy matters. It matters for getting the books back in order, and that's about much more than a set of numbers. It's about keeping interest rates lower and providing a solid platform for future growth. It's about ensuring New Zealand continues to be seen as a stable, reliable place to invest in and lend to. And it's about making sure we don't leave our kids and grandkids with debts they just can't repay.
I don't know about you, Craig, but talking about my kids and my grandkids, and I'm just going to hammer this dead horse because it needs to be hammered. If I won lotto this weekend and I could afford to buy my future kids and grandkids a house, it's like this government has given all that money away, then got an overdraft to buy the house, and then left that overdraft to the kids, because they had the ability to not leave debt to our children and grandchildren. Say it together, team. By not giving away $17 billion in tax cuts and landlord reimbursements. They chose to do that, and now they're all being worried about not borrowing too much. If they hadn't given away so much, this also wouldn't be a question. I know we've said it 3 times tonight, but I am not going to let this go.
The other thing here is that the other side of the equation is you can grow the economy more quickly. So you can encourage investment, you can encourage innovation, you can encourage employment. And so, you know, the best time to do that with government investment is essentially right now, when, you know, there are lots of people becoming unemployed, when there's lots of spare capacity in the economy, and all of that extra money just doesn't turn into extra inflation. And so when Nicola says we want to encourage growth, we want to encourage New Zealand to be a great place to be, what encourages growth and what encourages New Zealand to be a great place to be for other for companies is infrastructure. They can get their goods to market, that they've got a skilled workforce, that the workforce isn't sick and is looked after in a health service, that when they want to deliver, they have got a great IT system. The electricity market works and doesn't have huge spikes in electricity pricing as we do in New Zealand. That there's a credible platform for consistent investment. Instead, we've just pulled the rug over the past couple of years on pretty much all of that, and then just assume people will turn up because the right side are now in charge.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work.
I know we've kind of sort of covered this off, but I want to do one more thing. Chewie, you'll want to see this as well, because this is from the... Are we recording a new podcast tomorrow, Craig? Is that the plan?
Probably. I need to find some time to actually do it.
Very good. Because this is a slide that Craig had for the podcast we recorded on Saturday. Now, do you see this top line, Chewie? What does that mean for Budget 2025? The top line says, Budget 2025 has an operating allowance of $2.4 billion. And I'll read this out for the people who are...
throw it away.
Who are on the audio podcast. So Budget 2025 or 25 has an operating allowance of $2.4 billion. Only it doesn't, because $1.4 billion goes to health. Other pre-commitments, including Pharmac, are $300 million, so that's $1.7 billion. $700 million left. Only we haven't set aside anything for education. Removing that, $100 million. Defence has been promised new money. No money for police to reach targets. No money for regional growth fund. No money for going for growth fund. Funding will only come from cuts. And now, of course, I'm going to say the news that Nicola Willis gave us today was actually the Budget 2025 now has an operating allowance of $1.3 billion. And as you said earlier, $1.4 billion goes to health.
Gone.
And we're done.
But at least budget documents will be short.
True.
But in all seriousness, we could joke about this. What this essentially is saying is we're going to have to cut by billions of new dollars in order to make this work. Now, the question then is, where does that come from? The Crown spends about $125 billion a year. About half of that is pensions, welfare, and other what we call transfer payments. So there's about $60 billion left. About $45 billion of that $60 billion is health and education. So let's assume you're not going to cut that. That means you've got approximately $15 billion left. So you're going to need to find an extra $1 billion a year just to stand still. And then if you want any new investments, you're going to have to cut further than that. So you can see it's not just a small percentage, because you're trying to find that out of only $15 billion of remaining discretionary expenditure. So that means very significant cuts for other government departments. The problem we have is you may be able to do that if we just come off a really good year. Yep. But we've just come off a year where we've just cut again. So how we get to that place, and again, the timing is really bad. We haven't given departments the space to make those decisions. We haven't talked to the public about what that's likely to mean for services, which ones are going to get cut, how they're going to manage, how all of the non-government organizations who work with government in communities, how they're going to react and how they're going to manage the delivery of their services, like the Salvation Army, like Downtown City Mission. So there's all of these problems just spell chaos at the budget.
Oh, Craig, it's very generous of you to give us some time while you're over in Australia. Obviously, we're going to be talking again, you and I, in the next 24 hours. Chewie, you've been sitting there listening to a lot of this. You want to add anything in just before we wrap up with Craig?
I have two questions for you, Craig, kind of on the same thing. There's always talk about returning the government books to a surplus. How many times has National achieved that?
We saw a surplus in 2014. Bill English saw a surplus that year, and then it went back into deficit. We saw ironically, the Labour government in 2019 delivered a $7.5 billion surplus. Nobody noticed. And then we went back into deficit during COVID. We, if I look at a country like the US, which is over the past 30 years has had a really good economic growth record, over I think it's 25 years, it's been in surplus 4 years.
Yeah,
New Zealand's been in surplus many times, but most of that was under Sir Michael Cullen and then Grant. But we've had a much poorer economic growth record. So if these two things are related, they're actually related negatively rather than positively.
So this is my follow-on question. It seems to me that a lot of countries that do have a good economy, like the GDP's good, the growth's good, everything seems to be humming. There's absolutely or very little focus on whether they are in surplus or not. Like if things are getting built and your people are happy.
Yep, and so that the simple thing here is that if as long as the economy is growing, you can be in deficit and your debt to GDP ratio is actually falling because the economy is growing more quickly than your debt is rising. So as a consequence, yes, you've got a Orbigal deficit of $500 million, but if your revenue has gone up by $1 billion, then it doesn't matter because your debt to GDP is falling over time, and as a consequence, you're actually cutting debt. It's falling in comparison to the overall size of the economy. So
then we come back to the same thing that we've spoken about before. The problem is New Zealand's economy is not productive enough.
It's not productive enough. And why is it not productive enough? It's because we have consistently failed to invest, because we over invest in housing, because we have built our growth on dairy, timber, beef. Those are good things, but we also need to grow the other parts of the economy, and we have signally failed to do that over 4 decades in New Zealand.
But austerity will work this time, right?
Well,
it's going to work this time.
Beatings will continue until morale improves, and and this is pretty much where indeed. And this is where we are at. Where we're going to. We're going to try it again. A journalist asked me this morning, was this an austerity budget? And I said, it might not be, sort of, let's not label it an austerity budget, but it's pretty close to one. If it's not a true austerity budget, all of the things are there. We're cutting when we don't need to. No one's forcing us to cut, right? There are other things we could be doing to fill the gap. We're choosing not to do those. Instead, we're choosing to be austere. We're choosing to deliberately withhold things from ourselves rather than actually delivering the things New Zealanders need.
Hey, Craig, I love it when you come on. You always leave us feeling so happy and cheery at the end of the conversations.
Apologies again. One day I will come on here with good news. It looks as if there's good news in Canada, at least. Yeah. So I'm very happy about that. With the Canadian election there, and it looks likely here in Australia, without wishing to jinx it, that the election there election here will go really well. But in little old New Zealand, we are left, unfortunately, facing a government that seems to want to continue to deliver more of the kinds of austerity budgets and politics that we've seen in New Zealand's history, in other countries' history, and we know the consequences of them because we've been here before.
Yeah. Hey, be safe, be well, have a good time in Australia, and I guess you and I will talk in maybe the next 18 hours or so, eh?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Craig. Appreciate you coming on.